So, let's talk today, as all Christians will, gathered around the globe, about Easter. And if you are not a part of the RiverTree family on a regular basis, let me explain that. From the months between December and now April, we as a church family have been walking together with the Gospel of Matthew in your New Testament, one of the 4 histories of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And so this morning, we're going to keep our attention on Matthew's Gospel. And we're going to look at something that Matthew and only Matthew tells us. Not Mark, not Luke, not John. Matthew is the only guy who tells us this part of the Easter story. This takes place after the events of Jesus' resurrection and his appearance to the first disciples. While the disciples were leaving the tomb of Jesus, some of the Roman guards who were at the tomb went into the city, Jerusalem, and told the chief priests, that is, the Jewish religious leaders, everything that had happened, by which they mean the resurrection of Jesus. After the priests or Jewish leaders had assembled with the elders, other Jewish leaders, they devised a plan to give lots of money to the soldiers, telling them, you must say about what happened, his disciples came by night and stole him or his body away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, that is, the Roman authorities' ears, don't worry, we'll satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story is still told among the Jewish people to this day. Here to me is the most interesting takeaway from this unique part of the Easter story as told by Matthew. It should have worked. It should have worked. If you were living 2,000 years ago in the part of the world that we now call the Middle East, in the province of Israel, which story would you be most likely to believe? A, Jesus' many disciples, who numbered in the hundreds, massed together and robbed his grave after his death so that they then could tell the story of the resurrection and propagate the faith that he started. Or B, Jesus actually rose from the dead. Which is the most logical to your ears? The most reasonable? The most plausible? Let me suggest to you that it is the story that the Jewish leaders concocted that day. Their conspiracy theory. Now, their theory was not airtight by any means. Here are some of the holes in the story that they came up with to explain Jesus' empty tomb and what his followers would say about it. Number one, they said that if the Roman guards should ever get in trouble, they just need to say that they fell asleep. Well, here's the problem with that. If you were a Roman soldier and you fell asleep on watch, that was a death sentence. So they would effectively be admitting that they committed a military crime that was worthy of their execution. Seems like a hole in the Jewish leaders' theory. And also, one well-trained Roman garrison was overpowered by a bunch of ragtag, poor, untrained, unskilled fishermen and the like from Galilee. Not to mention a bunch of women. We're told numerous times in all the Gospels that many of Jesus' followers were women. These must have been the worst soldiers ever, if that happened. So it's not as if the story that they came up with as a knee-jerk reaction to the resurrection was airtight. But at least admit with me that it is more reasonable than the disciples' story that Jesus actually rose from the dead. As the first Christians would travel around and tell of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, as recorded in the rest of your New Testament. As Christianity spread from the Middle East to what we now call Turkey and North Africa and Greece and Italy, sometimes they would use historical evidence as an argument for why people should believe that Jesus actually rose. For instance, the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, St. Paul says that at least 500 people saw the risen Jesus, some of whom were still alive, and you could actually go talk to them about the experience. So yeah, it's true that the first Christians used historical evidence to prove the resurrection, but that's limited. Here's how you know that's limited. Let's say 500 people got on the news tomorrow night and reported that they saw a UFO. Not only did they see a UFO, but it landed in their backyard, in their neighborhood, and they interacted with aliens from outer space. How likely are you to believe those 500 people that actually happened? Now, I will leave it to you to decide whether it's a fair analogy that someone rising from the dead is the equivalent of seeing an extraterrestrial, but it's in the same zip code. So historical evidence alone is simply not enough to explain why Christianity took off like wildfire across the known world, the Roman Empire, and why it is that this story the Jewish leaders came up with didn't work. It seems to me on face value, it should have. It should have worked. Which leaves us to ask, why didn't it? Why didn't this perfectly reasonable story, concocted by the Jewish leaders, dispel the notion of Jesus' resurrection? Well, I'm glad to say we don't have to guess. As the first Christians traveled over the known world, they would have to explain what they believed about Jesus, including his resurrection. And the way that they explained it is a window into why this story that the Jewish leaders came up with didn't work, and why it is that the resurrection is the center of the Christian faith. Let me show you two of the ways that the first Christians talked about the resurrection of Jesus and how somehow it got around or transcended this story that the Jewish leaders were trying to pass off to everyone, to do away with Jesus. First, everyone who knew Jesus, everyone who encountered Jesus, knew what kind of man he was. Seems like in the Gospels, the only people who didn't like Jesus were the people who felt like he challenged them or put something they held dear at risk, like the Jewish leaders. He confronted them and wanted to topple the religious system that they had in place. Everybody else, the marginalized, the poor, the working man, the women, the sick, they loved him. And sure enough, that actually mattered a great deal. Here's something that is representative of how the first Christians in the history of the church would talk about the resurrection of Jesus. The history book of the church in your Bible is the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, which comes right after the Gospels. Over and over again, when the first followers of Jesus have to explain why they believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead, they use the kind of person Jesus was as a starting place for that argument. Note the way that this is Peter talking at the end of Acts chapter 3. He will make the same argument in Acts chapter 2. Stephen makes the same argument in Acts chapter 7. Very common. What's Peter say? Jesus was the holy, righteous one of God. You read about him in the Gospels. Most people, even people who aren't Christians, have a great deal of respect for Jesus. Not hard to say those kinds of things about Jesus. He's holy, righteous, just, wise, gracious, etc. And sure enough, the Jewish leaders and the fickle crowds finally got sick of him, and they killed him. They said no. And God's reply about Jesus was yes. You can say no all you want, but God gets the final word, and his word is yes. The resurrection is God's yes to humanity's no to Jesus. We all, somewhere deep inside of us as human beings, want to believe in resurrection. We'll talk about that more in a minute. One of the things we want to believe about resurrection is that if anybody should have been resurrected from the dead for being murdered unjustly, it would have been Jesus. Not us, but him. Here is, in Peter's words, the holy, righteous one of God, a singular person, a voice of wisdom and truth and love to us, someone who did and said things that no one else ever has. And he was cruelly and unjustly murdered. And God said, here's my yes to your no. I'm going to bring him back from the dead. Over and over again, the first Christians made that case about the resurrection of Jesus. And it's very interesting that very often in our day we don't connect those dots. We certainly don't connect those dots for unchurched people who find believing in the resurrection to be really hard, not very credible. If Jesus is who we think he is, if he is the person that you encounter when you read through the Gospels, if he said the things that are written there, if he did the things that you see there, then there is something inside of you that leaps, that hopes, that yearns for the resurrection to be true because you don't want it to be the end of the story, that somebody can say no to a life like that. And God responded by saying, yes, you cannot keep this man down. I will vindicate him. The resurrection is the vindication of Jesus, according to the first Christians. And that simple line of reasoning, that simple explanation, helped Christianity take off like a prairie fire all around the known world. And that story, that conspiracy theory told by the Jewish leaders, was powerless in the wake of that. Here's the other way that the first Christians explained the resurrection of Jesus. As they went from town to town, country to country, and talked about this man who lived and died and rose again. They tapped into this universal human belief in afterlife or resurrection, but they talked about it in ways that the world has never seen before. One of the great historians of the era of the Bible in our day and time is a guy named N.T. Wright. And he said that Christianity said things about the resurrection, and specifically said the things I'm about to describe to you about the resurrection that nobody else in human history had said prior to them. Here's how Christianity changed what we thought about resurrection. Yes, it's true, human beings tend to believe in that kind of thing. Christians were saying something very unique about it. You can see it in these words written by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8. The equation or the sequence is very simple. God raised Jesus from the dead. That took an extraordinary work of power for God to do that. You've never seen anyone rise from the dead before. Every other person you loved and known seems to still be held in the grip of death. But Paul says Jesus, through the power of God's Spirit, was raised from the dead. Now here's the amazing thing. That same Spirit and that same power is now able not just to raise us from the dead when we die, but take that future power that will rise us from the dead and pull it into the present. And you can begin to experience the very same power that can cause someone to rise from the dead in your life right now. And it can begin to transform you. It can begin to change you. It can make you what you are not or have not been, and you can become something totally different, totally better. It is the same power at work in you to change you that rose Jesus from the dead. This was the Christian explanation of the resurrection. This is how they talked about why it is Jesus rose and why it matters. See, what they were doing is they were changing the way that we think about resurrection. So often, when human beings, Christian or not, think about life after death, it is entirely secluded to the future. It is something you and I have not experienced yet. We'll only experience it one time, in fact, after we die. How do you know it's true or not then if you have not experienced it? The Christian response is, but you can. Now. You don't have to wait for heaven in the future. You can begin your transformation into what you will be in heaven right now, through faith in Jesus and the same power that raised him from the dead. Amazing. This was convincing, apparently, to enough people that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people would clamor to and run to the Christian faith and accept it. But you can understand why. The guy who was a criminal last week is now serving someone this week. The person who was an indifferent rich person last week now cares for the poor this week. The person who had no self-control and was riddled through with addiction last week now has self-control this week and is helping others get freedom too. And all of a sudden, all these non-Christian people were watching the lives of people that they knew be changed in ways that they couldn't explain other than the operation of a power greater than themselves. The operation of a power known as God Almighty, the same power that loosed Jesus from the grip of death and brought him back to life. Seems to me like what we as Christian people gathered this day need to remember is that the greatest proof of the resurrection that you and I will ever have is the way we see its power in operation among us now. And that was a compelling enough case that the world within a generation of the death and resurrection of Jesus was changed. And that message of hope spread across the globe. People yearn to believe that's true. That they don't have to wait to heaven for substantive change. The power of heaven can act in their lives now. The same power that raised Jesus can raise them up to new life now. So why is it exactly that you believe in Easter? If you're honest, if you're a Christian person and you have a lot of tenure in church, the reason you believe in Easter is because everybody else does. You were raised to believe it is the only rational, credible explanation for why it is that the Christian faith took off across the known world. Okay. It's okay that you've been a part of a community of faith that gave you the answers about what Easter is, even if you never really dug into it a whole lot yourself. But at some point you have to face down, why is it exactly that you believe in resurrection? And it can't be because somebody else told you to. Moreover, this is a good morning for you to do that, because you need to realize that there were people active just days after the resurrection of Jesus to dissuade everyone they could about it. To say, oh goodness, no, that's not what happened. What happened is the disciples stole the body from the tomb. That is a far more reasonable, rational explanation. And yet, there is something inside everyone. There is something inside the 70-year-old here today that has been a Christian for 50 years. There is something inside the 18-year-old today who has never been a Christian. There is something inside the 25-year-old. There is something inside the 55-year-old. There is something among the poor. There is something among the middle class. There is something among the rich that yearns for the story of Jesus' resurrection to be true, and very likely for the reasons that the first Christians used to explain it. Not simply because it's a historical fact, but because we long for it to be true. We long for it to be true that a man like Jesus cannot be kept down, and that God would not be God if he let a man like Jesus be crucified and murdered and stuck in a tomb? And to humanity's no to Jesus, God said yes. I beg to differ. My last word on who Jesus is and how just and good he was, that he was my holy and righteous one, is that I am going to raise him from the dead, and even your attempts to kill him will not work. And there is a part of you that longs to believe in a God that just and good, that committed to somebody like Jesus. And there is a part of you that yearns, just like there is a part of me that yearns to believe that this whole notion of resurrection is not confined to the day you die, to something abstract and far off like the afterlife, heaven. There is a part of you that yearns to believe that the same power, the same divine power that raised Jesus from the dead can now be yours in some small and yet transcendent way. That you can rise above what you have been your whole life. That you can stop being the worst of who you know you are. That you can be released and freed into new life. A life that kind of looks and acts like Jesus himself. The same power that raised him from the dead, you can have. If you simply say, I believe. I believe. And your new life will start today and will culminate. Graduation day will be the day you die. And it's finished. Would you pause for a moment and pray with me?